Snow fell without sound in the godswood, a slow sift of white that seemed to grow from the air itself rather than fall from any sky. The weirwood's face watched it come with immemorial calm, red leaves lacquered with frost and slick as blood under glass. Winterfell breathed like a great animal at rest, the walls muffled in sweating rime, the yard lit in broken plains of moonlight and firelight where men and women went slowly about important errands with the hush of a place that knows its own heartbeat is a borrowed one. In the pools beneath the heart tree, ribbons of ice rose like smoke. Jon stood with his gloved hand on Longclaw's pommel and listened to the gods listen to him. "You always hide here when you want to be honest," Arya said from behind him. He hadn't heard her step, only felt the faint press of her presence. As one feels a memory one cannot place and yet knows is true. "I never learned to pray properly," Jon said. The words set small clouds adrift from his mouth. "I keep hoping this place will teach me." "The tree doesn't care," Arya answered, coming to stand beside him. The red leaves made a thin whisper. "It listens, but it doesn't care. People care. Sometimes too much." "Perhaps," Jon said, and the smile he attempted bit his own lip. He had slept scarcely an hour since the horns on the walls began to bellow 3 nights ago, when the scouts vanished into a colder cold. He had slept scarcely a thought since Bran told him what he would do. Arya's eyes were winter dark, gray with a steel he recognized as the shape his world took when he had no choices left, and so the only choice was to be the blade. "You don't have to do it," she said. "And if I don't?" Jon asked. She watched a snowflake dissolve on the knuckle of her glove. "You know what happens if you don't." He breathed out, and the godswood took his breath and froze it as ornament for a branch. He had known refusals in his life, refusals of name, of father, of home. Refusals that had bent him like a young tree to the south wind but had not broken him. This one he did not have. He had known since Bran's voice, calm and distant as the sound that ice cracks make in thaw, told him the Night King could be bound by an old law he only half remembered. The law of challenge before a heart tree under witness. "I think he remembers," Bran had said, looking not at Jon but at the space in front of Jon where only the snow was. "Not as we do, as ice does. Patterns remember. The first men swore by the green and the white, and the others were born from a promise. There are rules as old as the pact, and he is one of them. If you call him, with the eyes of the old gods on you, he will come." "We don't know that," Sansa had said sharply, because sharpness kept the fear steady. "We don't know what he will do when he comes, or if he cares for rules, or if he will see you speak and simply raise his hand and turn you to glass." "We know what he will do if he doesn't come," Jon had said. The map was between them, candles pricking it like a constellation whose meanings no maester had had time to write down. Little cutouts of stone and wood stood where hope stood. They had fewer pieces than the enemy had steps. "We have one way to end it quickly. This is that way." No one had said the better word aloud, though it rustled them like a wind in tall wheat. Sacrifice. Jon had thought of it then not as the word meant in old stories, burnt offerings and boys in white, but as any man knows it, which is price. Every good thing cost, and the only question men ever truly faced at the end of their lives was whether they had paid enough, and for the right thing. He had looked at Bran in his chair under the weirwood, to whom the best and strangest of them had already paid a price none could count. Looked at Arya, who carried her price like a second knife in the ribs. Looked at Sansa, whose price was a castle she wore like skin. Looked at Dany, who had crossed the world on a price paid in names and screams, who watched dragons sleep in her eyes. The cold had spoken, too. It had spoken from the broken stones of Eastwatch and the empty towers of Hardhome and the iron ranks of moving dead, speaking with the blunt, pitiless honesty of an axe head. Now, in the godswood, the stillness drew tighter, as if the place was drawing breath. "Promises are for the living," Arya said. He heard the unsaid part as clearly as if the tree had mouthed it. "But rules bind the dead. Whatever happens," she added, and the snow on her lashes did not melt. "I'll be where you need me to be." He turned and touched her cheek, where winter had stung it pink as a berry. "I know." He left her then, because he wanted to and because there was no more to say, and because for once in his life he could not bear the ache in her eyes, which was the exact weight of what she would do if he asked. The weight he would not put upon her this time. The godswood path led him back through the mouth of the castle, where men stood in pairs speaking softly to their spears and horses, and to the yard where gray light and torchlight made a strange dawn. Sam was there wrapped in furs more numerous than his sins, which he kept track of scrupulously and was always adding to by kindness. "You're sure?" Sam said, skipping any hello, as if words were expensive and the breath to say them scarce. "No," John said truthfully, "but I'm certain." Sam nodded miserably, which was his way of blessing a man he loved to do something that would likely hurt both of them. He produced a small cloth-wrapped bundle from inside his furs and held it like a man holds a bird with a broken wing. "I've been working on the edges since we came back from Dragonstone," he said, unwrapping the Valyrian steel dagger that had been a secret and then a revelation and then a tool, as all secrets and revelations must become. The blade looked like moonlight hardened into harm. "It's still as sharp as books say, and I thought, well, one sword and one knife is better than one sword, isn't it?" John took the dagger and felt its thin hunger. The weight was not weight. It was history. "I won't throw it away," he said. "Please don't," Sam said, making a wet, incautious sound, and tried to turn it into a cough. There were other goodbyes, or what passed for goodbyes when none of you would call it what it was for fear of making it true. Davos bowed his head and called him M-Lord in a way that meant my son. Grey Worm saluted with a flat hand and a flat eye that hid a tenderness he would have considered a wound. Missandei touched his sleeve and said nothing and carried away his heat as if she had gathered it for Daenerys. The hound grunted and spat, and if his shoulder brushed John's, then perhaps it was because the yard was crowded. Brienne nodded with the solemnity of the horizon. Theon met his eyes across the yard and looked down and then up again, like a man looking at the sea he has left and the sea he must cross. Daenerys waited at the foot of the gate tower steps with Drogon's shadow falling across her like a cloak. She wore no crown and needed none. Her hands were bare to the cold and steady with it. Jon thought of her on the other side of the world, tasting salt wine for the first time, climbing the bones of a city that had burned itself out long before she was born, learning what it was to be wind and bone and wanting. He thought of the first time he had put his hand to the scaled heat of her dragon and felt something old and wordless say yes in his chest like flint. "If he will answer to you," she said, "let him answer to both of us. There is no old law that does not acknowledge fire." "If he denies the rules," Jon said, "I've no wish to see him deny them to you." She looked up at him, as if she were measuring him for some garment only she could see. "You aren't mine to keep safe," she said, and there was fierceness in it softened by a grief older than the wall. "But I would very much like to try." He took her hand and warmed it with his. For an instant, the cold relented around that small island of skin. "If I fall," he said, "make it matter." "If you fall," she said calmly, which is not the same as coolly, "I burn the world to cook his bones." "That would matter," Jon said, and because the world was a cold room and he was going to leave it very soon, he allowed himself the cruelty of a smile. When the horns sounded again, the sound was flatter than it had been, as if the last breath in the hornmaker's lungs was shuddering toward silence. Men and women ran to their places as if making a promise with their feet. The creak of bowstrings tight as grief, the mutter of horses low and patient, the peculiar, careful swear of men trying to put on gloves with hands they could no longer feel. Jon walked to the Godswood Gate, with Davos and Grey Worm flanking him and a thrum going through the stones as if the castle had discovered that it, too, had a heart. They opened the gate. Night did not pour in as it had in other nights. Night stood there like a guest with its cloak drawn up. He stepped into the snow. The Godswood held the temperature of a tomb. The Ironborn and the Wintertown men arranged themselves around the clearing, an accidental circle that had become ritual in 3 breaths. Theon stood by Bran's chair with a bow that made a long, questioning line. He looked like a word crossed out and written again. Bran's face was stiller than ice. Snow sifted over his dark hair like quiet dust. In the trees, the ravens were quiet as coins on a table waiting for hands to choose them. John went to the heart tree and put his palm flat to its sticky face. Sap clung to him. The cold stung the touch until it became all there was. He could not feel his hand when he took it away. "I call you," he said, and he spoke to the white silence. "By the old gods." And he looked at the red eyes and the white wood. "And by the new." And he kissed the hilt of Long Claw, which had seen more oaths than most seps. "I call you to single combat, Night King. Meet me before the heart tree. Let the dead stand witness. Let the living stand witness. If I fall, the north is yours and the south is yours and the world is yours. If you fall, we burn your name out of the snow and let the dawn come. No sorcery save what we carry in our blood. No arrows save what we throw with our hands. No army, but each man's shadow. Do you remember? Come and show us what you remember." There was a long, long nothing then, which was itself an answer. Even the torches behind him seemed to cower. He did not look back. The snow ate his ears until the world seemed very distant. He could hear only his heart and the remembrance of other hearts. In that one stretched instant he thought, with lucidity that felt like madness, that he had been wrong about everything and that the dead had no laws and no ears and no eyes. He thought of the boy who had gone to the wall with a name and a sword and the certainty that he would be cold forever. He thought of a man who had taken a knife in his heart and decided to go on living, because the alternative was to break under the weight of love. He thought of his sisters and his brother who was a tree and of the woman behind him who wore dragons like a fortune. He thought. The cold changed. It thickened, as if a door had opened onto a colder room. He did not see them arrive. They were there and perhaps had always been there, as stars are there at noon. The trees whispered in a voice of hoarfrost. Shapes resolved themselves at the edge of the clearing. Tall and thin and reflective, as if someone had put men where the ice had wanted to be, and given them weapons to remember how to move. The White Walkers stood as still as statues carved by a god with no love for curve. Behind them, like a tide that had forgotten to move, the whites pressed up to the tree-line and then eased back, and then crowded again, all without sound. He came last or first. The Night King moved like silence moves. The crown of knives that was his brow had caught snow and held it in iron array. The eyes were blue in the way that a winter noon is blue shortly before it kills a man. He was the memory of hunger. His armor made a small light of its own, a sickly reflected moonlight that the torches did not understand. In his hand, the spear of translucent ice. He came to the place John had marked with his voice and stopped, and tilted his head very slightly, the gesture a man makes when encountering a language he knows but has not spoken in a long while. Two of the White Walkers went step for step to either side, describing a circle John could not see but felt close around the shape of him and the tree of the world. The dead behind made no sound at all. John saw Theon's arm draw the bowstring like a breath held, saw Bran's eyes close and open, saw Arya's place among the branches, no more than a suggestion of too still air. He did not look again. The Night King lowered the spear and brought it up in a kind of salute that mocked all salutes. John drew Long Claw. He held the dagger with his left hand, the blade reversed along his wrist where a hand that had lived in a castle and a hand that had lived on the ranges both agreed it belonged. He had Corin Halfhand's voice in him, and Gior Mormont's, and the old First Rangers, and the voices of men whose names he had forgotten until he needed them to tell him how to live. He saw the way the Night King stood. He saw the weight on the back foot and the open shoulder, the easiest lie a swordsman tells the world. He did not know whether the Night King had ever been taught, or had taught himself by watching men die. They came together like two branches thrown into a strong current, smashed apart by the same force that had flung them. Steel met ice and the noise was like the breaking of a church. Longclaw bit, and the bite sang up John's arm, clean and hot. The spear glanced and left a line of dead cold along the cheek where it whispered past, an unhealing line already pearled with frost. He stepped in, and the Night King did something John had not expected. He stepped back. The spear came around as a pivot, smearing the air with cold. John ducked and felt the spearhead pass where his skull had been with the certainty of regret. He struck at the knee. Longclaw kissed ice and a spurt of rime went up like the breath of a poisoned horse. The Night King murmured his spear along Jon's blade until the metal shrieked its complaint and a flare of blue crawled along the fuller. Jon's teeth hurt. He moved because he must move. The sword felt light, but time felt heavy, and somewhere a small boy was crying, and perhaps that small boy was him, perhaps not. The Night King came on again, spearing like a snake striking from under a rock. Jon took the first, parried the second, let the third ring against the dagger hilt, turned into the fourth and cut. The speed was inhuman, but Jon had fought inhuman things before. Speed mattered, but so did intention. The Night King fought as if he had never been tired and would never be. Jon fought as you fight when you have carried a body that was yours to a cold table and begged the world for a different outcome and been denied. Around them the circle shifted, not with motion but with insistence, as if the cold wanted to help its king and could not. Jon saw, in the corner of his sight, a White Walker's hand tighten on its sword. Felt, in the bones of his feet, the god's wood itself thinking in roots. He could smell the sweat freezing in his hair, could smell the ancient sap in the heart tree's breath, could smell the dust of old bones in the Night King's wake. He fainted low and to the side, and the Night King answered with something like contempt. The spear came up and down in a snapping arc that sought to peg him to the earth by the shoulder. Jon caught it, barely, on Longclaw near the hilt. The impact jarred him to the kidneys. His left hand came up on its own, the valet of some other version of him who had remembered a lesson before he had learned it. The dagger bit for ribs. The Night King turned, not quick, not slow, simply original, and the blade took him high on the chest where the edge met plates that had once been hammered by winter. Metal that was not metal screamed. The wound, the insult, really opened a very thin line and closed again with a white light that was also not light. They broke apart. For an instant, Jon could measure himself by his breath. He could see his breath in front of him and imagine that it belonged to him and not to the day. The Night King cocked his head again and lifted his free hand. Jon's heart went small and fast. He knew what that meant. He knew it from the fall of Viserion out of the cold sky, from the jerk of the dead rising like bad decisions in the night. The Night King's hand described a slow half-circle, imperious, sovereign, as if he were conducting the weather. The whites stood like a sea at slack tide and did not move. The Night King's hand finished its arc and stopped. He had answered without words. He would not call the dead to be a third arm. "So you remember," Jon said, and he did not know if the Night King heard, and he did not know if it mattered, and he did not know if he was speaking to the man, the thing, or to the law that bound whatever he was to the tree that watched them both. He stepped in, and this time he did not try to be faster than something that did not understand the word. He fought like a man who had dug post holes in frozen ground, who had hauled wet rope on a dark deck, who had slept in his clothes and woken to sleep again standing up. He let the Night King drive him. He let himself look like the sea wrack a strong wave pushes back for the pleasure of dragging it forward again. The spear came. Jon turned. The spear came again, a glittering piece of January. Jon let it whisper his throat, let it touch his sleeve, let it collect small rents in the edges of him that could be paid for later. He waited for the mistake. Came not because immortals are careless, but because every pattern contains a repetition. The Night King always drew the spear up with his left hand too high by a finger's width. The butt end swung wide and the hand came over it. It was nothing. It was everything. Jon stepped in not against the spearhead but against the off end, drove his shoulder into the place where the Night King's armor shifted, slid along ice and felt it try to freeze him to it, stamped his heel down and pivoted with Longclaw low. The steel rose with a motion learned a lifetime ago under a man who had loved him like an axe loves a hand. The blade chopped. He felt it carve. He thought absurdly and precisely of chopping through a thick knot of frozen rope on a black night at Castle Black. The resistance argued and then gave way. The head came off cleanly. It did not fall. It shattered. It turned in the air one half of a moment, the blue eyes wide with the absence of surprise, and then became a spray of pale shards that tinkled on the snow with the delicate sound of new glass breaking in an empty house. The body stood a fraction of a breath longer, as if offended by the absence of instruction, and then slumped to its knees and came apart, not dissolving but separating into facets. like a miracle done backward. The world did not end. It stopped, and in that stoppage the dead remembered what they had been. Not men, not histories, not grievances, but empty boxes waiting for a name that had been removed. The whites at the Trilene collapsed like puppets whose strings had been cut by a kind god, and then like puppets whose strings had passed out of existence. The white walkers shattered as if into 100 small winters that died before they could spread. Snow fell, and no one breathed, and the gods would Ade, a small groaning noise deep in its roots, the sound a boat makes when it comes unexpectedly safely to harbor. John stood with Longclaw still in the finishing of the swing. He was looking at the place where the Night King's face had been and seeing nothing there. He felt, all at once, every ache that had waited politely for him to finish. He felt his cheek where the cold had written its warning in a line. He felt the blood in his mouth and what his legs were doing to remain legs. He felt, also, an absence, and did not know whether it was relief or a hole torn out of the shawl of fear he'd wrapped around himself so long he had begun to love it. He turned slightly and saw Bran's eyes. They were the eyes of a boy who had fallen and learned to be a crow. The eyes of a tree that had learned to be a boy. There was approval in them and sorrow, which together make wisdom. The living remembered all at once that they were living. There was a sound, not a cheer, because no one in this place had that left to spend, but not a cheer. It rose like heat. Theon made a small, involuntary sob, caught between laughter and another thing that could have been the beginning of either repentance or joy. Arya dropped like a cat from someplace that had not been there a moment ago and appeared beside Jon without a step in between. "You did it," she said, as if that were a thing a person could say about death. Her eyes were on the dagger in his left hand. He had not realized he still held it. Somehow he had not dropped it even when he'd cut a god's throat. "I think we did it," Jon answered. Behind them, the torches found their courage. In the larger yard, the fighting had already dwindled to pockets of confused motion. Whites stumbling into walls and lying down heelless and headless and finally still. Men and women looking around as if someone had switched the world and not told them. A cry went up in a voice Daenerys had taught to be queen, and a dragon's shadow crossed the moon. In the moment when silence became party to the living again, Jon's legs remembered they were made of meat. He stumbled, and Arya's hand was there and Davos's hand, and a hand he realized with surprise belonged to Theon. He did not push any away because he had been alone long enough and because this was what victory looked like. Not a banner, but hands. They brought him inside the Godswood Gate and then shared the task of bringing him across his own courtyard, which had once been the universe and now seemed only something he had to pass through. He saw Sansa at the top of the steps with ghost-white hair and a set jaw and tears like diamonds because everything was expensive now. He saw Sam with Gilly at his shoulder and their faces like worn parchment but sweet. He saw Brienne and Jaime, both bleeding in symmetrical ways from opposite sides of their history. Saw the hound's mouth twist as if between two lines of a poem he hated. Saw Grey Worm standing in a small lake of red snow and looking down at his hands as if they had disappointed him by not shaking. Daenerys came to him like fire made flesh, which is to say not like a woman but like a promise. She did not touch him until she had looked him closely up and down and satisfied herself that he was still there under the blood and the cold. Then she put one hand around the back of his neck and rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes for 3 long counts that will be the 3 longest remembered by every living thing that saw them. "You kept your word," she said softly, and there was something like wonder in it and something like accusation, which are often the same thing when they are honest. "So did he," Jon said. They laughed, and because they laughed they both hurt, and because they hurt they both became themselves again. The next hours were work. Men and women who had prepared themselves to die arranged wood for those who had done it in their place. The bodies of the whites were no bodies at all but the clean memory of what had been used. They swept the refuse of war like a winter housewife sweeping ash from a hearth. The true dead, Lyanna Mormont small as the word bravery. Dolorous Ed with his mouth open like a joke he hadn't had time to finish. Nameless free folk who had taught Southerners in the last days how large a small people can be, were carried to the yard and laid in rows that none tried to count. Jorah Mormont bled and lived, which was a surprise to every onlooker except Daenerys, who had refused him the right to die and had been obeyed. Grey Worm, who had expected to be a name in someone else's mouth that night, found himself alive and misliked it, and then said a quiet prayer to a god he disbelieved in and set about calling the Unsullied who answered to his name. The dawn that came was uneven but not false. It broke against the eastern sky with a pale already bruised by smoke. Fires ate. The square scent of pyres filled the air until it wrote itself into the stone as a second mortar. The living stood and spoke the words of their many gods, and the gods listened with the patience of mountains. Sansa spoke for the ones who had worn fur and mocked at Southron ways, her voice steady as a ledger. Davos for the men the sea had taken and would take again. Missandei gave the silence of Noth to the dead, and they wore it with grace. Jon said little. He had blown himself out in a particular kind of speech and had no more words to fling. He touched the hilt of Longclaw to each bier and in that way said the same thing to each. I see you. I love you. I am sorry I grew older when you did not. When they were done with that part of victory that looks like defeat, they went to the great hall and sat where heat was. The hall was not full, because fullness was gone from the world for a time, but it contained what the world now had to offer. Bowls of stew that tasted of salt and iron and onion. Pitchers of something warm that made your lips feel like they belonged to you. The sound of 100 shoulders sliding back down a finger's breadth. Laughter came timidly as if it expected to be told to leave, like a dog that might not be wanted in the house. It was allowed to come and sit by the fire. Davos leaned in to Jon. I have sailed through strange waters, lad, he said. I've seen storms fall out of a blue sky and men turn to fish for love of a coin. But I'll tell you plain, I never thought to see you take the head off death like a salt cutter takes a cap off a bottle. I hadn't thought of it like that, Jon said. He had tried not to think of it at all. He was aware of the scar on his cheek the way you are aware of someone watching you in a room when you do not know who they are. It will not stay here, Daenerys said, not to him, but to the table and the room and the castle and the north. Her eyes were clear, the style of clear wine poured into a crystal glass for show. Cersei knows now what we have done. She would have known had the dead come for her. She knows as it is. She has Euron's fleet and she has hired Sellswords and a monster to captain her lack of honor. She will write songs about herself until the last singer's throat is crushed, and expect us to dance to them. The songs will not be about her, Sansa said quietly. Not now, not ever again. Songs are dangerous, Tyrion observed from further down the table, where he had arranged his cup with exquisite, awake care. He had not spoken much in the last day. He had been looking as one looks when one is trying to find a loose stone in a wall. They can make men believe things have happened that have not, or that things that have happened for the reasons the singer likes best. Better to write laws. Better to have food, Arya said, around a mouthful of bread, which she had pocketed and then removed and then pocketed again out of habit. Food and beds and less smoke. The North will recover, Sansa said. It has before. She turned to Daenerys. If we march now, we leave our people eating ash and fear. If we do not march, Grey Worm said flatly, Cersei grows stronger. She grows crueler, Missandei corrected gently, which is not always the same thing as stronger. You won, Brienne said to Jon, as if the council were a single opponent and she was training him to stand against it. If you had lost, all our choices would have been taken from us. Because you won, we may choose, and because we may choose, we must choose well. Jon looked down at his hands. He had expected to die and had not. He had expected it so thoroughly that he had not planned for the other, and now living had become an improvisation. He remembered his vow under the weirwood and understood something he had not then. He had not bought the world for himself, only bought it a little time. He would have to keep buying it with smaller coins now. He looked up. We mend, he said. He saw, in the narrow nods of the people he loved, the balm and the pain of being agreed with. We mend what we can mend in a fortnight. We bury every dead with their names. We send ravens to every river lord and every lord of the Vale and of the Reach and of the Stormlands and ask them what they want their children to say they did when winter came. We ask Edmure Tully whether he prefers to feed men or feed crows. We ask Yon Royce whether he would like his Aerie to have a world to look down upon. We ask the Tyrell bannermen if their wheat tastes better in their own mouths or in Cersei's. And we ask men of the city if they would prefer to live on their knees under a queen who cannot afford to let them live, or on their feet under one who prefers them alive. Then we go south. Under whom? Sansa said, and it was not quite a question. He looked at her and did not look away. Under whoever will not set us on fire, he said. And if that was a joke, it was not funny. Daenerys's chin lifted a fraction. I will take the city with as little blood as can be spilled, she said. I take no pleasure in burning men, but the Red Keep is stone and iron and treachery. It may demand fire. Let me break their walls, Arya said, light as snow. I can slip in and cut Euron's throat while he naps on his deck like a beached eel. You cannot be everywhere, Sansa said, not unkindly. And I will not spend you like a coin that can be struck again if I lose it. We will need ships, Davos said, and a plan for ships. The surest way for King's Landing to keep its heart beating is for Euron to keep its throat clear. We cannot march Kitchen south. We will starve outside her walls as neatly as any Lannister could wish. Yara came in then, as if summoned by the word ships, snow in her hair and a smile like a small knife. I have 11, she said, and I can take 3 more from men who owe me and don't yet understand how much. Euron's fleet is bigger but lazier, and he keeps it fat on fear and pride. He'll nose out of Blackwater like a boar and be confused when he finds himself ringed and cut. You run your dragon over him and I'll light the scorpions as they try to light you. There are ways to kill a kraken. Your way, Theon said from the doorway, voice shaky with cold and something that had nothing to do with temperature, has always been to sail right at it. Yara looked at him with a quickness that softened around the edges as if someone had warmed the blade. She said. Sometimes it even works. She crossed to him in 3 strides and put her forehead to his as if testing to see whether he had fever, and then pulled him in by the back of his neck. You were born to be iron, little brother. Try not to die wooden. I'll do my best, Theon said weakly. Tyrion drank and set his cup down with the care of a man setting down a new treaty between unfriendly nations. We need an idea, he said, looking at Jon. A moment as sudden and indecent as your idea tonight. Something that makes our enemies rearrange themselves before they can decide not to. Challenge again, Bran said. His voice entered the conversation the way a bird enters a house. Quiet and inevitable. This thing you have done has memory now. Men will try to fit the world into it. Challenge whom? Jaime said. Cersei? She would send the mountain to meet you and call it chivalry, and after he broke you, she would describe it to the court poet. She has always loved stories in which she is honest and the world is not. Then we write another, Brienne said. Jon thought of the hours between asking and answering in the Godswood, of the taste of fear and the sound of the dead pressed like a held breath at the edge of the trees. He thought of what it had been to wager a world on a rule too old to have a name in common tongue. He thought of the law that had bound a monster to stand on a patch of snow and fight like a man. He thought of how men can be better monsters than monsters. Trial by combat, he said, older even than Seps. Cersei believes in it when it suits. She puts faith in her champions. She would name the mountain, Tyrion said, grimacing as if he had bitten a sour memory. She would, Jon agreed. So let her think she will win it with that. Meanwhile, we turn her city against her by coming as liberators, not conquerors. We starve the Golden Company of coin. We make Strickland an offer he likes better than dying for a queen who burns her own. We ask the faith to remember how many of their die were burnt in the September. We write to the poor fellows. Every city has poor fellows no matter what their names are. We tell them we bring bread and a queen who has enough sense not to set it on fire. Daenerys looked at him as if she could see his plan assembling in the air. And who fights the mountain? She asked, and her eyes moved, unavoidably, to the hound where he sat gnawing obediently on a bone. His brother, Jon said, but he said it to the hound. The hound's answer was a snort that might have been assent and might have been something else that had brought him all this way. "And if Cersei sends no champion," Sansa said, "then she admits to the city and to whatever gods she professes to honor that she is wrong," Tyrion said softly. "And she does not do that. She will send him. She will trust in the story she's told the world about herself. That she cannot be beaten when the rules are cruel." "I will not let the rules be cruel," Daenerys said, and it was a promise and the beginning of a vow. 2 weeks turned into 12 cramped days when they tried to fill them with rebuilding, and then into 14 because time is elastic when you need it. The north became a hive. Wheels creaked, smithies coughed, cook fires spoke in sibilance. Children were put to the useful work of carrying kindling and news. Old men and women sat where weathers and wars had left them and told anyone who would listen about the winter 50 years ago and the winter 100 years ago and how this one had been like those and not like those and what that must mean. Tormund led the free folk in the repair of the eastern wall, and if he made a game of it, no one thought less of the wall thereby. Sansa collected tithes of grain with the expression of a mother weaning a child who thinks itself starved and later would learn it had lived. Gendry hammered until his shoulders smoked and made a dozen new scorpion bolts and then threw away half of them and made them again better. Arya disappeared and reappeared with the unscared toes of couriers and the sore-throated reports of ravens, gathering not quite intelligence and not quite rumor but something truer than either, which is the shape of how men felt. Jon walked among his people and did the older, more difficult work of letting them say his name and not turning away. He shook hands that trembled and hands that squeezed as if they could transfer strength back into him. He answered questions and made no promises and made one promise which was the only one a man like him could make: that he would try. He slept little and dreamt less. When he did, he dreamed of a blue face coming apart like a breath on glass and woke with his hand gripping a blade he had left on the table. Daenerys divided her days cleanly like a general does, and a queen. Mornings spent on the wall and in the yard among soldiers she would take south. Afternoons with ledgers and lists with Tyrion and Sansa and Davos and Missandei. Evenings with her dragon and Jon. He had not thought himself a man for evenings. He had spent too many of them in cold halls wrapped in cloaks, and when he had lain with women it had been brief and grateful and freighted with winter. With her, time stretched. She told him the names of winds in the Dothraki Sea where the grass sang. He told her the names of the first men who had given themselves to the ice, though no one remembered them now. She had him say the word home and he did, and she did too, and they both seemed to hear it in a different key and did not try to make the other sing in theirs. The day they marched, Winterfell did not see them off. It watched them the way a big dog watches a man leave the house for work, knowing the man will come back and that if he does not, the house will wait anyway. The columns went south like a river, the unsullied steady as rows of carved doorframes, the northern levies with mail clean and boots oiled and nothing like parade in the way they moved. The few Dothraki left riding with their shadow half broken and the other half burning brighter for it. Drogon and Regal moved the air above them. Ghost loped beside Jon and looked up at him with the yellow eyes of a god who had consented to be a dog. At Moat Cailin, the wind came up from the south with the smell of water not frozen. At the twins, what was left of the Freys tried to make themselves small, and the army went through them like a thought through a tired mind. In the Riverlands, men came out of farmhouses and touched their foreheads when Daenerys rode past, and then when Jon rode past, and then when Arya and Sansa rode past, and then sat down suddenly on their thresholds as if thinking had tired them. At the Trident, ravens met ravens and made small wars above their heads that Davos appeased with salted meat. They marched mostly in silence and sometimes in song. They stopped to bury dead the road remembered that had not been claimed by kin. The river, swollen and peevish, ran beside them like a commentary. Tyrion and Jaime rode together, sometimes in a conversation that had no witnesses and ended with one brother shaking his head and the other looking at the sky as if expecting a stone to fall on him. On the fourth morning south of Rosby, Yara's vanguard of ships came into Blackwater like a knife between ribs. She had meant to make noise and she did. Her black sails popped like slaps. Euron came out from under the shadow of the city with the leisure of a man walking out of his own door, and the sea between them became tight. There are ways to kill a kraken and ways for a kraken to kill itself. Yara had learned both. She ran light and hard. Her archers sent hate in neat arcs that found eyes and pulley housings. Her decks were low and fast and turned like cats. Euron's scorpions answered with steel bolts that split spray and air and sometimes men, and he laughed and chased and cut, and his laughter was both a weapon and a flaw. He wanted a story, Yara wanted a fight. While he chased, Drogon dived. The scorpion bolts rose like hedgehog quills. Rhaegal came on them from an angle no one had trained for and took them in the belly of the wind. Then they were over the decks, and fire had its say. King's Landing saw and smelled and heard before it understood. Smoke went up like a signal the city cannot ignore. We are vulnerable. Varys's little birds whispered it into the keyholes, and rat are you. The Dragon Queen is here. The Stark who took the Ice King's head is here. The sea is catching. The cell's words have names like gold, but no gold that does not come out of a barrel in a cellar. Harry Strickland, who had learned his trade on other people's fields far from home, took measure of the walls, and the purse Tyrion's owl-eyed messenger laid before him, and the slender man with gentle hands who said, in the soft accent of a far island, that the queen he served wished no harm to the poor and would not leave the city to famine. Harry had brought men to war for worse reasons and left wars for better. In the end, he did as Cell's words do when they are asked to die for someone else's pride and tempted with a chance to live with their own. He led his men out of the Golden Company's neat lanes and stacked weapons quietly in wagons and disappeared, not far, but out of the way. When Cersei sent for him, he could not be found. When someone finally found him, he had shaved his beard and was a carpenter from Myr who had always lived in Flea Bottom. Cersei stood on the height of the Red Keep with black hair pinned exactly where she had meant to pin it, and looked at a city that had been hers by habit and now felt full of strangers. Qyburn murmured at her elbow the way a man does who thinks what he says is what reality is made of. The mountain stood, and being stood by him was like standing in a night that is thicker than other nights. She watched Drogon pass and keep his fire for scorpion towers instead of for houses, and she watched Rhaegal do the same with unsoldierly kindness. They will come to the gates, she said. The sun laid a warm hand on her cheek. They will ask to speak. We will refuse. If we refuse, Qyburn said brightly, they will be the ones to begin the blood. I will have the sappers move more wildfire to the second level. No, Cersei said, not yet. Let them try their tricks. Let them sing to my people. Let them think themselves different. Then, when they begin to believe it, when the little ones truly look up and imagine themselves protected by dragons, we will show them that dragons are only fires made mobile. She smiled, because she had never loved anything as much as spoiling a childlike thing in others. The army of the living set up banners within bowshot and did not shoot. They ran kitchens, and that smelled like mercy. They set up a tent with a painted seven-pointed star and a weirwood leaf and invited men and women to pray and to talk, and sometimes gave them bread without asking them for anything at all. They set up another tent where Missandei and Davos took names and complaints and asked questions like how long since your last meal and what would you ask of a queen who did not hate you. They mended boots. They spoke softly even when they were tired. They let the city come to them, and when it did, they did not snatch. Cersei's men scowled from the walls and found fewer and fewer stones thrown back by the crowd. On the second day, the bells were rung at noon by men who wanted to hear bells and not by the queen, and the city blinked at the sound and did not panic. Jon rode under a white flag to the gate with Brienne on one side and Grey Worm on the other and Davos behind, and the Hound, who would not be kept from a road that had his name writ on it, and Tyrion because he always came where he might suffer most. The gate opened a hand's breadth and then a whole palm, and Qyburn came out like a lizard who had learned to pretend at civility. You will have heard, Tyrion said by way of greeting, that trial by combat is an old custom and not always dishonorable. Qyburn put his hands together as if about to pray to physics. You propose a trial? He said. What is the accusation? That her grace has held what is hers? That she has defended her city? That she has, by virtue of birth and planning, triumphed over those who would take her place? That she murdered children by fire, Davos said roughly, and men, and you helped. That she blew up the great September of Baelor to make a point, Brienne said. That she used a madman's fleet to drown good people, Missandei said. That she would starve her own to keep one chair, Jon said, and it was a sentence with as little gall as he could manage and still make true. Qyburn smiled with a soft, furry sort of pity reserved by some men of learning for those who do not read. "Her Grace admits to no crime," he said. "Then we accuse and demand the right," Tyrion answered. "We have a champion. She may name hers. Let the gods decide what they will keep." "Her Grace calls the mountain," Qyburn said without turning his head. "I thought she might," the hound said. He had taken off his helm. He looked older with his face in the free air, softer and more ruined and more worth saving. "Tell your corpse to wash behind his ears." "It is not your right to demand such a trial," Qyburn said. "You are not citizens of this city." "We are its people," Missandei said. "We are what Her Grace should have loved." Qyburn's smile did not change. He had never been loved by anything that did not die screaming. "Bring your dog," he said. "We shall let the gods see how clever dogs have become." They fought on the cobbles because it was level and because the city had to see what it had paid for. The mountain came out in armor as joyless as his breath, and the hound stood across from him like a statement he had always wanted to make and not known the grammar. Jon watched as he had watched himself in the Godswood, and the crowd watched as crowds do, with hope a little ashamed of itself and greed, and a surprise at its own capacity to love strangers.
"Stil met hate."
The mountain struck as walls strike when they collapse. The hound took the blow and turned and returned it with the workmanlike fury of a man chopping ice to get at water. He bled early and often and did not seem to notice. He looked at intervals at Cersei on the wall and smiled, which was a prettier sight than any small smile she had ever permitted herself. He talked to his brother when he could catch breath between swings, as men talk to graves when they are drunk. It did not matter what he said it. In the end, the blade went where the blade goes when a man finds the part of himself that wants to live more than he wants to win. It went up under the right plate and tore, and then went in again and then again, and the mountain made a sound like a house full of broken furniture and came down. The hound went to both knees, too, with infamous relief. The crowd poured its feeling out all over the square and found that it was not empty afterward. Qyburn stood very still and thought of his lists. Cersei's mouth was a line cut with a rule. She had expected a story in which she triumphed by cheating. She had forgotten that some men come to stories with knives. When Qyburn opened his mouth, she closed it with 2 fingers and turned away. The gates opened wider the next morning. Bread went in on carts and men came out with their swords the wrong way up, hilts first. Strickland's boys were gone, and the City Watch had decided it had better homes to go to than a wall, and that those homes would not be improved by being on the wrong side of a dragon. The Lannister garrison moved backward up streets with the practiced grace of men who have been told to defend something that cannot be defended and will not burn themselves to prove the order good. Jon's army moved forward slowly and with orders repeated in every squad. If it runs, do not chase. If it kneels, do not strike. If it cowers, let it stand. Grey Worm enforced the orders with the zeal of a man who preferred orders to the alternatives. Missandei stood by the first gate with a piece of chalk keeping count of names who took amnesty and how much flour went to which alley. When someone tried to snatch an extra loaf, she slapped his hand and then gave him a smile for the telling of it. Daenerys flew, briefly, at rooftop height to look men in their faces with golden eyes. She did not breathe fire. She did not need to. It was enough that she did not. Tyrion went into the Red Keep by a little way only he and a handful of others knew. He found Varys's old rooms and a scrap of parchment left on the table and felt the absence like the missing tooth his tongue could not stop counting. He found Jaime in a corridor with a sword he had not drawn and hands that could do harm but chose not to, and regarded him for a long half-minute. "Are you going to try to kill me?" Tyrion asked conversationally. "I've tried that," Jaime said. "It took poorly." He took a breath. "She won't run." "I didn't suppose she would," Tyrion said gently. "She has always loved high places." They found her in the audience chamber with a chair that had always looked like a joke from a certain angle and now looked like one from every angle. She wore red and white and a smile that had been carved. She did not stand when they came. Daenerys came last, walking as if the floor had remembered how to hold. Jon beside her, as if escorting a woman to a dance he expected to be dangerous and necessary, and the city's breath close behind them like heat. "You broke my city," Cersei said with tired disdain. "We opened your gates," Daenerys said. "The city broke itself in your hands." "Fine words," Cersei said. "Will you stick them in my eye? Will you feed them to me with your pretty servant's hands?" Her gaze slid to Missandei and then back as if tasting an old cruelty and finding it bland. "Or will you build a new September to posture in?" "I will build bakeries first," Daenerys said, and it was not a threat. Cersei stared. She did not understand a world where someone would say that and mean it. It was not capital she could spend. Her mouth twisted. "You cry trial and you make a show of mercy," she said. "You bring the wild wolf and his knives and the snow bastard who has mated with weather and the whore queen who taught you tricks. You mean to make me small." "You did that," Sansa said. She had not expected to speak, but when the moment came she stepped into it. "We watched you for years. You could have ruled. You chose to preen." Cersei looked at her thoughtfully and smiled in that small, horrible way that had made men jump to throw the knives of her wishes. "And you," she said, "you could have served. You chose to pretend at power until someone gave you some. How is it? How does it sit on your shoulders? Do you feel the eyes? Do you feel the knives? Do you sleep, Lady of Winterfell, or do you count breaths?" "I hope you count breaths." "I count," Sansa said simply. "It keeps me honest. They could have killed Cersei there and no man would have wept for her. They did not. They led her out, under guard but unbound, onto a balcony where the city could see her and asked her to answer. And she answered as she always had, with contempt. And they sentenced her to a long enough exile in a convent of the faith that the faith understood mercy was a weapon and wielded it properly. And she went with her head up and her jaw hard and her eyes doing arithmetic that the gods had already worked, and the city breathed out. The work began. It was not glorious. It was not the kind of work that poets can be made to do for little money. It was hauling stone and moving rubble and setting up tent markets and making ropes out of rag and making men remember how to be kind to one another. It was measuring grain and hiding nothing from anyone about how much there was. It was writing letters to Dorne and the Eyrie and Highgarden and asking quietly and firmly for wagons. It was men like Davos and women like Missandei and boys like Podrick Payne standing in courtyards with notes and sending bread to one alley and soup to another and water to all. It was the unsullied standing like cold doorposts until doors could be rehung and then moving 2 streets down to stand again. It was Daenerys doing nothing dramatic for 10 days and learning that nothing dramatic can be the most dramatic thing a queen can do. In those days a shape emerged, not of a realm under a single hand, but of a realm under a single weather. There were councils under councils, spiderwebs of work. People began to forget to look up when a dragon passed and began to look down to see how firm the cobbles were. The bells rang in twilight to mark the end of curfew, which had or had not officially existed, and the city began to make its own noise like a self-winding old clock. And then the question could not be put off. They met in a hall that had not been planned for greatness but was willing to house it. Men came from the Vale and men came from the Riverlands and from what the Reach had left. The Dornish sent a woman with a dry voice and a look that could measure you without humiliating either of you. The North came in force because it had been asked and because it had decided it would attend things now that things mattered again. Lyanna Mormont's cousin with a face like an axe and a name that could not scrape away the grief. Lord Glover with an apology and a handout. Lord Royce with his armor properly polished and his mind properly cleaned. A dozen smaller men and women who had learned nothing makes you taller like standing up. The free folk came, too, because Jon asked them and because Tormund had said, with the cheerfulness of a man going to a wedding with no clothes on, that he would enjoy seeing Southerners count. It was not a great council in any sense a maester would recognize, but it was a great one. They sat. Tyrion stood. He did not drink before he spoke. "We have 2 questions and a half," he said. "Who rules the South? Who rules the North? And what binds the two in peace?" He looked at Daenerys and then at Jon and did not flinch at either look. "We have what few kings have had, a choice." "I will not bow to fire," Lyanna's cousin said bluntly. "We have had our own kings and queens, and when we did not, we had our own lords. Every time we bent the knee to a southern crown, an axe fell in our yard before winter did. I know what it is to bend a knee that should not bend," Sansa said. "I will not ask the North to do it again." Daenerys listened. and the listening itself turned something in the room. "I did not come to make slaves," she said. "I came to break a wheel that had made them. I have never believed blood to be anything but ink men used to write lies on the world. If the North would be its own, let it be its own. I ask only that it be close to me in friendship." "You would give it?" Royce said slowly, astonished and suspicious and begrudgingly approving all in one long syllable. "It was never mine to keep," Daenerys said. The hall made a sound. Not surprise, not applause, but something that contained both. Jon looked at her and felt something move in him, a glacier breaking, not falling to crush anyone below but shifting in a way that would change rivers downstream for 100 years. "The Six Kingdoms," Tyrion said, making the words carefully as if they were the first part of an oath. "With Dorne being, as ever, particular, and the North a friend to them all. Who rules the Six?" Lord Tully's niece asked. She had the red hair of her house and the practical fingers of a woman who had cut bread for too many nephews. "Let them choose," Daenerys said, and when the shock had ebbed she added, "And let them choose me for as long as I do what I have said I will. Keep them fed, keep them safe, keep them free to tell me when I am wrong." "And when you die?" Royce asked kindly and clinically. "We have had enough of fathers begetting sons who cannot bear the weight of their fathers' hats." "Then let them choose again," Jon said before she could. He had seen it clear as a line. A council not of victors but of neighbors, not of swords but of hands with ink on them. "Let there be a great council when a sovereign dies, and not because a dragon hatched in a noble bed. Let there be a road that power must walk that is not cot or cradle. Let the lords and ladies pick the one who should sit, and if the one chosen does not do as they said they would do, let them be invited to leave with honors and let someone else sit. Let the crown be a job." "And who sits now?" the woman from Dorne asked, amused. Jon looked to Daenerys and the world narrowed to her face, which held something that looked very much like joy and very much like fear, and so must have been love. He could give her this and he could not give her himself, and he could not. The choice that had been sitting in him like a knife went quiet. "I do not want it," he said, and his voice carried because truth carries. "I do not want the South. I do not want any chair. I want a world where the men on the walls sleep sometimes and the women in the kitchen smile. I will do what I can to build that, but I will not be king. If enough of you have any sense, you will ask Daenerys Targaryen to be queen, not because of dragons or because of birth, but because she crossed a world and suffered and learned and did not burn you when burning would have been easy." He paused and allowed himself a very small smile. "And because I have seen her ledgers, and God's help me, they balance." There was laughter, and in that laughter consent. There were objections, and there were questions, and there were small deals to be made, none very ugly. In the end, they set it down on parchment and, more importantly, on breath. Daenerys of House Targaryen to be queen of the Six Kingdoms, to be held to account by a council of lords and commons chosen by their peers every 5 years. The North to be independent under Queen Sansa Stark, who would hold council at Winterfell with her own lords and commons and send a man or woman each year to King's Landing to remind the South what the North smelled like. The faith to tend to souls and leave bodies. To their owners, the dragons to be kept out of bread ovens. The city watch to belong to the city and not to the throne. The ships to be used first for grain and only second for war. It was absurd and fragile and right like a good chair. The day they crowned Daenerys, the bells rang and no wildfire burned, and that seemed miracle enough for the city. She wore a dress not of a queen but of a woman comfortable in her skin, and on her head they placed something that looked more like a wreath than a weapon. She spoke of food and roads and ships and peace, and then of war in the tone you use when you are explaining how to mend a fence. She named a council of people a poet would never have thought to put in the same line. Tyrion her hand, Davos master of ships, Missandei mistress of whisperers because she loved people and would not break them to get information, Grey Worm commander of the city's forces until the city's forces could be trusted to command themselves, Gendry master of coin because he was too honest to retrench to impress anyone, Samwell Tarly, brought south with his books, to be Grand Maester because he would write I do not know in a margin when it was true. Brienne of Tarth to the Kingsguard, captain and conscience. Jon stood with a small smile at the back and watched a city choose to breathe. He felt Ghost press his thigh like a friend at the end of a long night. Arya stood beside him with a face like a coin that only family knows the value of. Sansa on his other side held herself very straight and very tall and looked 10 years older and 10 years younger than she had 2 months ago. Bran watched from a seat that was not a throne and saw something none of them saw and perhaps told the trees about it and perhaps did not. Afterward, when speeches were made and wine was poured and men remembered that they could tell a joke without offending the gods, Jon Foe. Indeed, Daenerys on a balcony where the city came up in waves and broke and retreated and came again. "I am not going to ask you to stay," she said lightly and broke his heart with the first word. "I am not going to ask you to come," he said, and then laughed, "because sometimes love is a mirror and it breaks politely." "I have work," he said. "The wall, what remains, needs a Lord Commander who believes the purpose of it is not to wait for monsters but to keep the doors in good repair. The free folk need someone south of the gift who speaks their language and can listen. I can make new vows for a new order, one that keeps rather than keeps out. I can be useful if I walk the edge of things. If I stay here, I am a shadow in rooms where you need light." She nodded. She understood this better than he did. She had crossed the world only to learn that she must stop and let virtue find its own pace. "I will need you," she said simply. "You will have me," he said. "Not in your bed," he added with a smile that knew too much and hurt him to give, "but on your roads, which is freer and kinder." They kissed once, not as lovers but as allies who had tried the other thing and learned they valued each other more this way. They did not say goodbye. They walked out into their own stories and could find one another in the margins when they wanted to. When Jon rode north again, the air did not seem as cold. Men do not change weather, but men who have done their work can find the wind's teeth less sharp. Ghost ran ahead and Tormund sang and Arya rode for a time and then peeled west with a wave of her hand and a promise that came from the part of her that had always belonged to river and horizon. She would go and find out what lay where maps stopped pretending. Sansa returned to Winterfell with an escort that looked like a procession because a woman loved by her people is a procession without trying. Bran stayed in King's Landing a month and then went quietly home by Raven when the trees told him they had missed him. At the wall, what was left of it, the men who had refused to leave their posts stood and tried not to stare at their resurrected Lord Commander. He did not sit at tables much. He went up and down steps and walked the line where stones met the world and spoke to the men who would live here now. Women came, too, because the world had changed and the wall could change with it or be left a museum. The new vows were shorter and put more weight on the promise to keep men safe than on the promise to keep men out. The first wedding was held in a storeroom in the Shadow Tower with ghosting candlelight and a cake that was more ambition than pastry, and afterward the singing went up and someone found a fiddle and the night was good to them. Letters came. Daenerys wrote concisely with a humor she allowed few to see. 2 scorpions had been found in a cellar intact and given to the smiths for study and the bolts turned into plowshares. The Dornish woman had browbeaten the Reach into sending grain with the conviction of a woman whose people knew thirst. The harbor was changing shape without permission from planners, and she was letting it make its own decisions for now. Tyrion wrote often and drank less and complained that he had run out of synonyms for tax. Sansa wrote on heavy paper in a steady hand. Her sentences were the sentence of a good rule. Clear, kind, exact. Arya's letters were small and light and full of strange facts about winds no one in the north had names for. Sometimes there were no letters, only a little twist of something like salt and something like saffron tied up in a scrap of cloth that said, "I am alive and so are you." 3 winters later, Jon stood again in the God's Wood of Winterfell. The weirwood had grown some, or perhaps he had become smaller in the way men do when they set down burdens gladly. The air had a different sound, less like knives being sharpened and more like looms. He put his hand on the face of the tree and felt the sticky of resin and the age of the world under his palm. He thought of the night he had said the old words and made death come like a man to fight on his feet. He thought of the head falling away and becoming a sound that had released the world from a single note. He thought of how many more notes had been allowed since then because they had dared to ask for one terrible courtesy and been granted it. "Do you remember?" he asked the tree softly, smiling. "Do you remember what I did? I know you don't care, but I do." Leaves moved. That could have been wind. Somewhere in the castle, a child laughed without fear. and the sound went up and over the wall like a bird that had decided to stay through winter. Ghost huffed at his side, old and scarred and perfectly himself. John sat a while on the stone he had sat on as a boy and a man, and he listened to the gods listen to him, and when he rose he felt a kind of warmth in his bones that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with the work still to be done and the work already done and the balance between them that is the secret at the heart of any good life. He walked back through the gate into a courtyard where men were arguing about grain, which is the best argument a castle can host, and he smiled as he waded into them, a man among men, a sword put back on its peg, a hand extended and taken and extended again. That night a hawk dropped through the open smoke hole into the hall with a letter tied to its leg. Davos's scrawl, cursing the sea for stealing his hat and asking whether the North might teach the South better knitting, as if knots and knitting were cousins. John laughed and passed the letter to Sansa, who read it gravely and then smiled, and they drank a sensible cup to the health of a queen who had kept her promises and to the health of a realm that had decided to attend to itself. Outside, the wind lifted and then fell and stayed kindly, and Winterfell did as any good house does when night draws in. It settled around its people, holding the heat where it mattered and letting it go where it did not. In the farthest north, beyond where the maps used to curl up and lie, Arya stood at the prow of a narrow ship and watched a new coastline right itself. She laughed once, sharply, for the sheer scandal of it, and then spat on her palm and shook hands with a sailor whose eyes had never seen a southern summer and said, "We'll call that one Wolf's Bay." And no god objected enough to send a storm. She wrote a note in her head to John that she would post to the wind when the wind was right. It said that the world was larger than sorrow and that sometimes a blade is a way to carve bread. And in the city of the south, in a room where dragons had slept before they learned to fly, Daenerys sat with figures and names and her hands dry humor and the noise of a market through the shutters and the smell of clean water and, sometimes, of mint. She balanced a ledger and smiled a little, remembering a man's awkward joke that had been also a prayer, and then she rose and went to a balcony and looked out over a city that would never belong to anyone again and therefore might finally belong to itself. Somewhere below, a baker pulled loaves out of an oven and did not feel fear. Under the heart tree the snow came thinly. It would always. The world had learned, though, that there are rules older than fear and that sometimes, if you ask a monster to be a man, he will remember how, for just long enough to lose his head, and the world had not forgotten who had asked. And in that remembering, men found they could be a little braver, and the brave found they could sometimes be forgiven, and the forgiven found they could sometimes be loved. Jon Snow took the Night King's head once in the clean cold under a red tree, and afterward he took up all the lesser burdens and carried them in the ordinary warmth of his hands. And that was the victory the realm kept, when songs had grown tired and law had grown sure. That a man had won a duel and then lived as if the duel had not made him a king, only a steward of a house with many rooms, where the fires burned even and the doors stood open in all seasons to neighbors who knew where the bread was kept.